where the funding is going to, and if we've really looked at this very carefully.
I think two things stick out here. First is you're also reminding us of what you had earlier said concerning the IMF loan, and that was even way before the president started thinking of borrowing. Perhaps we should expatiate more on that, because there's always this fear, even amongst economists like yourself, when there's a mention of IMF loan. It will seem as if it's a no-go area. But you seem to see some kind of beauty in it whenever you talk about IMF loan. Now you say it comes at zero interest rate. So tell us what the fear is for some economists that haven't a grasp of understanding of what the IMF loan is about.
The fear of the IMF loan is historical. The last time we had an IMF loan, there was the structural adjustment, the SAP debate as to what it's going to do to us and things like that. But the structural adjustments that we need to make, which really is how to put in a proper foreign exchange mechanism, which we now have, and the removal of the subsidies on the petrol would have been something they would have insisted on. We've done all those things. So we've cleared the way for any structural adjustments that we need to do. So right now, our economy is ripe for an IMF loan. The conditionalities that the IMF would have insisted on, we've actually implemented them. So there's nothing stopping us from getting the IMF loan. And like I've said earlier, there's more discipline. If you take the IMF loan and the World Bank loan, the World Bank will supervise those projects to make sure they're completed and ensure that they deliver the value that needs to be delivered.
Sorry to cut you there, those fine details which you say weren't really clear concerning projects that this money will be expended on. Will the banks, for instance the World Bank, be asking for such details? If you say you're asking for this sort of amount from the World Bank, would they also want to know the projects just the way Nigerians are asking, so that they can have that better supervision of those projects?
Yes, and if the World Bank doesn't feel that the project meets the development and the impact criteria and our ability to pay it back, they wouldn't approve it.
You're not talking about history, which is very, very key here. We can't take away the fact that Nigerians are really, really scared about our past and how much we haven't done pretty well when it comes to managing loans, and also how we're almost going on our knees asking for a write-off of some of these debt. Then what are those things we didn't do quite right that amounted to us not even servicing some of those loans?
Well, what we did in the past was that a lot of what we had borrowed went into consumption. And when you borrow for consumption, there's no investments or the returns to pay that back. So at a point in time where the situation whereby over 50% of our revenue was going to service debt. Right now, we're looking at about between 35 and 40% of our revenues that we're using to service debt. So that is really where your issues are going to be if you take debt. Debt is a very unforgiving instrument if you do not deploy it properly. So it's important that we realize that if we take this $30 billion, it will take our debt profile from $61 billion to $91 billion. So by the time you're servicing a debt profile of $91 billion and oil prices are low, you know that things are going to be tight. So that for every $1 you make, you're using 40 cents to service your debt. You only have 60 cents to do everything else that needs to be done. You don't want to put yourself in that situation. So it's very important. And also we have to take a look at these loans we're getting from China. The China Exim Bank wants to finance this Mambila hydropower project. Very commendable. But we have to take a look at the history of the Chinese. Most of this money would probably end up back in China, and the labor that they will use is probably a lot of their own. So these are the sort of things that we need to manage when we take these China Exim loans, to make sure that we get the value in our system rather than most of these benefits accruing to China. So we really need to be very careful with some of the China Exim loans that we're looking for also.
So if we can get loans from the World Bank and ADB, why would we need from the IMF?
The IMF does what you call the stabilization facilities, which will help us with managing the short-term shocks that we've experienced with foreign exchange. And they have these standby facilities, which is really what they're very good at. And if we can tap into that sector, a lot of all the shocks we're having with the foreign exchange systems, we should be able to start to resolve that very quickly, in addition to some sort of project finance that is also quite available.
All right, let's bring Mark in on this one. Mark, go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Chamberlain. Listening to you, Mr. Adebajo, there are definitely very many areas. But what we've seen right now is that this request has been kicked out by the Senate. Only last week, I think a committee of the Senate decided that the ministers for finance and budget should come and explain to them what the loan request was for. And there was a presentation of some sort. I think I was the only thing that gave Nigerians an insight into what it was that the federal government was demanding this loan for, needed the loans for. Would you say that that explanation was not satisfactory, or would you say that there was some deficiency in communicating what the loan was meant for when you look at the presentation that happened last week?
Well, from the presentation that happened last week, I think what we got was more the current state of implementing the existing budget and what they were trying to do to stem the tide of the recession. And it's ironic you mentioned this, because what happened is the fact that this year alone we have a 2.2 trillion naira deficit that we need to finance, that we haven't financed. And it was quite shocking when when the news came that there's a request for 30 billion of borrowing. And you can see that from what you said, the events of the last 2 weeks, there's been some sort of disconnect in terms of how things have worked. And what the Senate is saying in particular is the fact that they don't have the details, that they will need more details of these loans and what it's going to be used for, to be able to understand how they can begin to consider it. Okay. So I don't think they've rejected it totally for now.
All right, well, we'll take a quick break. We'll be back and continue our focus on this loan request. Join us again.